Hello and welcome to Devil's Advocate. This week sees the launch of a book that reveals the inside story of the assassination of Murtaza Bhutto, the deep divisions between the Bhutto family, and raises serious questions about former Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto. Those are the issues I shall discuss today with the author of the book, Murtaza Bhutto's daughter, Fatima Bhutto. Fatima Bhutto, let's start with your father's assassination on the 20th of September 1996. After the shooting had stopped and as the hours ticked by and he failed to come home, you rang your aunt Benazir Bhutto, who was Prime Minister of Pakistan at the time. What followed was a harrowing and chilling conversation. Let's start by asking you to give us details of that conversation.
Well, after some time had passed and my father didn't return home, and this all being before cell phones and text messaging, you know, there had been a huge build-up around our house. We were being surrounded by armored tanks, by policemen. We'd had enough, and I thought, I'm going to call my aunt, because perhaps they've arrested my father, perhaps they've done something. I'm going to call and ask what's up. And I called, and it was very clear the ADC, her operator, was already aware at that point of what had happened. He kept asking me if we were okay, if my family was all right. And I had no idea what he was referring to. And eventually I was connected to her husband, the current president, Asif Zardari, who said I couldn't speak to my aunt. When I insisted that it was important, he said, no, she can't come to the phone, she's hysterical. Of course, I was 14 years old, I had no idea what he was talking about, and I said, look, it's very urgent. And at that point, he very calmly and very coldly said to me, oh, don't you know? Your father's been shot. At that point, I dropped the phone. I didn't.
And it was in this callous, unfeeling way that your uncle broke the news of your father's killing?
Yes, and of course, to say that to a child, you know, not only a child, but a child who was so attached to her father, was so unbearably cruel that I convinced myself immediately that, oh, it must not be serious, otherwise why would he have said that to me?
And what you then discovered is that after the shooting, instead of taking your father to an emergency hospital, the police took him to a dispensary. Do you suspect that was to ensure that he in fact didn't survive?
Well, absolutely, and the tribunal that had, of course, no power to impose sentence or enact any legal punishment, said that it was done on purpose. None of the 7 men killed that night were taken to emergency hospitals. They were all taken to different locations. They were all taken past the time when they could have been saved. My father was taken to a dispensary, a place where doctors had their outpatient facilities, where you went to buy your strepsils or pick up your prescriptions, and a place at the time that had a sign outside its front door saying no emergencies. I mean, it was very clear that this was not a hospital where doctors could be found to save anybody's life.
So a man who was dying, who needed immediate attention, was taken to a dispensary which actually said no emergencies.
Not just that, but the police essentially dropped my father outside the hospital and left.
They didn't even register him at the dispensary?
No.
So they just disposed of him as if it was an unknown body?
As if it was an unknown body, yes.
Much later, for the purposes of this book, you interviewed Farooq Laghari, who at the time of your father's assassination was president of Pakistan, and he actually told you that he has proof that Asif Zardari wanted to eliminate your father.
Well, I didn't interview Farooq Laghari, but he was interviewed on various channels in Pakistan, only recently, in the past 3 months. And he came out and said that Asif Zardari, the current president, went to him when he was a sitting president and said, this man has to be eliminated.
Actually, in so many words?
You know, he's given the interview now in Urdu, in English, in Saraiki. And he said on television, Farooq Laghari, that Asif Zardari has the blood of Murtaza Bhutto on his hands, and God knows how many other people.
Do you believe that Asif Zardari is involved in the killing of your father?
Yes.
Do you believe that Benazir Bhutto has a role to play?
Yes, unfortunately.
I'm going to ask you to repeat that. You actually believe that your Bhua, your father's elder sister, is responsible in some way for the murder of her brother?
She presided over a state of lawlessness. My father was one of thousands killed under her second government. So certainly she bears a moral responsibility. And after his murder, my aunt played a very strong role in the cover-up. We were forbidden from filing an FIR. All the witnesses were arrested. They had no access to lawyers, to their families. In fact, they were kept in jail till her government fell.
So both before, then immediately after what happened, and then in the cover-up, at all three stages you believe there are serious question marks about her behavior?
Well, certainly, Masood Sharif, who at that time was the head of the intelligence bureau that reported to the office of the prime minister, who was at the scene of the crime that night, several years later was inducted into the central committee of Benazir's party. Now, to induct a man who has been accused publicly of your brother's murder sends a certain signal, I think.
Years later, right at the end of your book, you quote something she said in an interview just before Benazir died. She actually said that your father was responsible for his own death.
Yes. She remained committed to the police line, and just before murder, she tried to insinuate on television that not only did Murtaza have himself killed, that he had a sort of suicidal wish, but that his own guards killed him. She said that he was shot from the back, which he most certainly was not, and that his body bore tales of his death. And it certainly does. It just has nothing to do with the claims Benazir was making.
Now, your book also sketches out the growing differences leading to the rift between your father Murtaza and his sister Benazir. And in a sense, although the problems perhaps began earlier, they began to crystallize after the death of General Zia in 1988, when your father wanted to return to Pakistan. Your grandmother Nusrat Bhutto was in favor of it, but Benazir was bitterly opposed. Why was she opposed to her brother's return?
Well, at that time, 1 year after their brother Shah Nawaz's murder in 1986, Benazir had begun to negotiate with the military establishment in Pakistan to take power. And she was preparing, one would assume, to be General Zia's prime minister, who was still alive at the time. And the differences really started then. My father couldn't understand how she was willing to negotiate with the very establishment that had killed their father, that they believed had their brother killed, all for the sake of power. She was willing to accept the IMF dictates. She was willing to let the army control foreign policy.
But then when Zia died, and that chapter in a sense was over, why then did she stop your father from returning?
Well, I think the compromises remained. I mean, she was prime minister to Zia's number 2, who then assumed the office of president after Zia-ul-Haq was killed. One of the men she appointed as governor of Sindh had signed her father's death warrant.
Do you also suspect that she saw your father as a political challenge? She didn't want to share power with him. She wanted to be Bhutto's heir. She didn't want Bhutto's son to come back and enjoy the limelight or power or the legacy with her.
Well, certainly, and I think she very much did not want another Bhutto to say, why are these compromises being made on the blood of our father?
So neither did she want to share power, nor did she want her brother to question what she was doing.
Absolutely.
Now, 5 years later, in 1993, when he decided he would return and contest elections, and these were the elections that were going to bring Benazir back to power for the second time as prime minister, he asked her for a seat,
yes,
and she refused it.
Yes. She refused him a seat, and in fact the seat that he wanted in Larkana, that his father had run from, that my grandmother had run from, Benazir then gave to a new entry into the party, a man who had publicly welcomed Zia-ul-Haq to Larkana and presented him with an ajrak on his first visit to the city.
So the family seat of Larkana was denied to Zulfikar Bhutto's son and heir, and given in fact to someone quite different, and someone in your book you describe as a Zardari crony.
A Zardari crony and a Zia crony, as it would seem.
So in the family's eyes, this is really the ultimate betrayal.
Absolutely. Not only is it an ultimate betrayal, but the very reluctance of Benazir to allow her brother, who had been a paying member of the party since it was founded, a single party ticket, was incredibly, I think it shows her fear and how threatened she felt by it.
And also deeply, deeply hurtful.
Deeply hurtful. I mean, all he wanted was the ticket. He should have been allowed a chance to contest.
Now, in fact, your father did return. He returned in November 93, but at the airport itself he was arrested, and he was jailed for the next 8 months. You were 11 at the time.
Yes.
And in your book you recount how you set a sort of challenge to your aunt. You said to her, if you are being honest and have nothing to do with his bad treatment, come and see him with us in jail tomorrow. Yes. What response did you get?
When he was jailed, I asked my aunt, who at that time had protested her innocence, to come and visit him. And she told me that she would arrange something. And as the hours ticked by and it was clear that she was not getting back to me, I began to call her, as I genuinely believed that she couldn't really be behind all this. And she said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I can't come and visit Mir with you in jail because I haven't been able to get permission from the jail superintendent."
The Prime Minister of Pakistan couldn't get permission from a jail superintendent to visit her brother.
Well, that's what I said. That's what I said. I just said, "You're the Prime Minister." And she said, "Well, I can't get it, so I can't come." So it was clear then that she didn't want to see her brother.
During that period when your father was in jail, specifically on the 5th of January 1994, which happens to be your grandfather Zulfikar Bhutto's birth anniversary, Benazir actually stopped her mother, Zulfikar Bhutto's widow, from going to his grave.
Yes.
Because she felt that the mother was siding with your father Murtaza and not with her.
And that Murtaza, my father's supporters, would be accompanying my grandmother, that it would be a show of strength for her brother, who had never visited his father's grave at that point. And again, we saw the house in Larkana, the family house, was surrounded by police. People were locked into the house, people were prevented from leaving the house, and eventually the police fired on the house. We still have the bullet marks on the gate.
In fact, you write that the bullets just missed your grandmother Nusrat Bhutto.
A man stood in front of her. He was shot and he died later on that day, yes.
Later, your grandmother rang her daughter Benazir to ask why this had happened.
Yes.
And she was actually told that Indian raw agents had infiltrated the family home al-Murtaza.
Yes.
Did you believe that?
Oh, I don't think anybody believed that. There was an incredible show of state police and security forces in Larkana, really to prevent my family and my father's supporters from having their presence known. So when there are thousands of policemen crawling all over Larkana, how did raw agents manage to slip through this dragnet, as my father called it, of federal security office? I mean, it was ludicrous.
Now, your book also tells an account of the mysterious and so far unexplained death of your younger uncle, Shah Nawaz, Benazir's younger brother, in Nice in 1985. Years later, you interviewed the renowned French lawyer Jacques Verger, who was retained by the family in 85. And he sort of suggested to you that Benazir had a role or was complicit in Shah Nawaz's death. Did you believe that?
Well, it was shocking to hear, and certainly not just Jacques Vergès, but Shah Nawaz's daughter, Sassi, raised some questions that were very disturbing. It was a year after Shah Nawaz's murder that Benazir began to negotiate with the military, the same military she believed was responsible for Shah Nawaz's murder. She was reluctant to let Jacques Vergès take the case as forward as he liked. He wanted to bring into question the Pakistani security agencies, the CIA, and their possible role in the murder, and Benazir forbade it.
In fact, you quote Jacques Vergès in your book. He says, in her mind, with her two brothers, what her two brothers were doing wasn't helping her. Among the two brothers, the strongest brother was Mir. Perhaps it was necessary to get Shah out of the way because he was the weaker one.
Yes.
She got Shah out of the way.
Well, again, this is what the disturbing questions that he raised, Jacques Vergès, in that meeting. Shah Nawaz and Murtaza were both very opposed to American influence in Pakistan. They were very bitterly opposed to the American influence in Pakistan's politics. And at that point, Benazir was seeking, Jacques Vergès supposed, a way into the establishment.
So she needed to get opposition out, and if that opposition was her brother, well, she had to get him out as well.
It's a possibility.
Let's take a break at that point, Fatima Bhutto. I want to come back and put to you the one thought that must by now have occurred to the audience. Was Benazir Bhutto complicit in the killings of both her brothers? That's in a moment's time. See you after the break. Welcome back to Devil's Advocate and an interview with Fatima Bhutto. Fatima Bhutto, we ended part one with the feeling that your aunt Benazir Bhutto had a role to play in the death of both her brothers, and maybe she was even complicit. Can you really, as her niece, accept that she is responsible in some way for the death of both her brothers?
Well, in terms of my father's murder, I spent years researching this issue. I spoke to witnesses, police, survivors, and in that there is no doubt in my mind. In terms of her younger brother Shah Nawaz's death, this is a possibility. According to Jacques Vergès, who represented the family, according to Shah Nawaz's family, it is a possibility.
And neither of them would say this lightly.
Well, you know, I think what all sides say is that there were certain questions that have never been answered. And while Benazir was alive, she refused to engage in those questions. Why?
The portrait that emerges of Benazir from your book is not just of an unfeeling, cold, calculating woman, but to be honest, a person who's capable of great brutality, and maybe, if I can support it, even of great evil. Do you really mean to paint such a terrible portrait?
Well, I think Benazir is a very complex person to me. There is also a time when she was my favorite aunt, my beloved Wadi. She was a very complex person, but I think, in answer to your question, perhaps it's the nature of the beast. I think power is an overwhelming, transformative, and very often a destructive force. And Benazir was not immune to its powers.
Something that emerges is that the closer Benazir came to power, the more she became cruel and ambitious, and the more distant she became from her family and her brothers.
Yes.
Did power corrupt and ruin her?
It certainly seems that way. My memories of her as a woman struggling against power are incredibly different from the woman she was when she was in power.
She was your devoted aunt when you were a child. Today, when you look back on the Benazir Bhutto you've discovered through your research, the Benazir Bhutto you know of, who failed to help when your father was dying, how do you think of her today?
It's very complicated. I can't think of her except as these two sides. I can't see her alone as one. While she was out of power, she was a woman who faced great suffering, who was incredibly vulnerable and brave. But on the other hand, when she was in power, she inflicted much of the suffering that she endured on thousands of people.
Without realizing this was paradoxical and ironic.
Well, certainly she never commented on its paradoxical nature.
Is there a bit of you that still loves her today?
Of course. I mean, there is a bit of me that remembers that young woman who used to read me bedtime stories and who I felt safe around. But there is also a part of me that is still very frightened of her.
Is there a part of you that now hates her?
You know, I think hate and anger are incredibly violent emotions, and if you allow them to take over, they destroy you too. And I don't want to give them the power to do that, so no, I don't hate her.
The Bhutto family is a large family. You have many cousins, aunts. They will all have read this book. How do they respond to the portrait you paint of Benazir?
Well, it's not that large a family anymore, unfortunately. You know, I'm not in touch with them. I wouldn't know, actually. One would have to ask them.
Do you have any idea how Sanam's children or Benazir's own children, your own first cousins, would respond?
No. And to be honest, I think they experienced a very different side of her. I think they benefited greatly when she was in power.
Do you think, in a way, by writing this book, you've shared with the world the agony and the trauma you've gone through, but as a result of it, you perhaps have shut a door between yourself and your cousins?
That door was shut a long time ago.
Do you regret that?
No.
So does that mean that Fatima Bhutto is a Bhutto on her own?
It certainly has felt like that over the last 14 years. You know, we've been denied access to our grandmother repeatedly. After my father's death, it was like we lost his entire family. We lost my grandmother. My aunts filed cases against my brother Zulfikar and I when we were children. When Zulfikar was 9, our aunt Sanam filed a case against him. So I think we lost them a long time ago.
So it's Fatima on her own. Fatima Bhutto, a pleasure talking to you.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.